And I digress. Okay, so um, just a real quick recap. At the end of last class, we got up to the point where President Andrew Johnson had very much alienated the radical Republicans in Congress by vetoing everything that they put forward. Civil Rights Act, the Freedmen's Bureau that was building schools and hospitals in the South. Part of this was that he believed in a defense of states' rights, that the federal government should not be telling them what should they be doing, but mostly it was racism. The belief that there should not be any aid given to these newly freed blacks in the South. Certainly no land, certainly not the vote, certainly not, the right to equality in the face of the law, the right to testify against whites in court. He didn't believe in any of that. And he got away with it for the second half, of 1865, because the congressmen and the senators were back in their home districts. But when they came back, the fight was on. They tried to pass a civil rights bill, the Freedmen's Bureau Act, to extend the Freedmen's Bureau. He vetoed. They, in spite of the fact that the Republicans were in fact divided between a moderate and a radical wing, united to override these vetoes, and then pushed forward with the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed the right to citizenship to all people born regardless of race in this country. Andrew Johnson tried to he tried to campaign against that during the midterm elections of 1866. He was completely destroyed. The Republicans returned with an even greater majority, and the radical Republicans were even more powerful. And now is the beginning of radical Reconstruction, where the most significant changes in the South in American history took place in a short amount of time by purely congressional authority, and eventually the president, who just didn't stand in the way. But what's most important about this is that so much was done in such a short amount of time that there was going to be a reaction, a white racist reaction. And the fact that the North, that won the Civil War and initially imposed through military occupation some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about now, civil and political rights, they eventually got tired. They pulled out. And so what happened was the next 70 years of Jim Crow legalized segregation and disenfranchisement, taking the vote away from blacks in the South on a state level, which the national government could have challenged in court and simply through the use of the military to enforce civil rights, but they chose not to. They chose to unify the country, the white part of it, and to sacrifice Southern blacks to Southern whites so that they would stop Southern whites terrorizing the countryside. And, they would return to Congress, vote, and they would get on with the business of the nation, like building more transcontinental railroads by engaging in a massive industrialization of the country and propelling the country into global economic hegemony. So all of that was done on the backs of betrayed Southern blacks. So what is radical Reconstruction? It starts off in March of 1867. This is after the midterm elections of November 1866, where the Republicans and the radical Republicans were triumphant. So when they came back, they could pass anything they wanted. Do you remember the numbers I put up on the board last class, where I said how much the Republicans had in Congress and the Senate? And then I said to override a veto, you need a 2/3 majority. But then the Republicans in both houses had way more than 2/3. So they could do whatever the hell they wanted, and they did. The first thing they did was they passed the Reconstruction Act, which simply turned the South into an occupied country. The northern troops that conquered the southern armies, they just stayed there. Now, to guarantee civil rights and a safe voting environment, once that was actually put into place. Now, the original state governments that were put in place by President Andrew Johnson, that only allowed whites to take part and whites to vote, those were eliminated. They were tolerated for a year, but now they were eliminated. Johnson tried to resist that. His veto was overridden. Now, at this point, there's an increasing discussion about blacks and voting. After the Civil War, most people were not comfortable with taking that step. That seemed a little bit too much like full racial equality. But by 1867, even the moderates were thinking there is no way to guarantee equality in the South without giving full political rights. So, the 14th Amendment gets passed in 1867. It goes into law. Anyone born in this country, regardless of race, is a citizen. The next step is voting, but that doesn't happen for a couple of years because there's a fight. Congress goes up against the president. The president can nominate anybody he or she wants to serve in their cabinet. Secretary of State, Treasury, whatever. But then the Senate has to approve that nomination. You follow me so far? Now, once that nomination is approved, the Senate is out of the business. The president now can fire this person anytime they want. You need Senate approval to get somebody hired as a secretary in the cabinet. But as president, you can fire anybody you want. You don't have to ask anybody's permission. Congress changed that in March of 1867 with the Tenure of Office Act. Why? Because in the cabinet, one of the president's cabinet members, Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, was a strong ally of the radical Republicans and not a friend to President Andrew Johnson. Now, Edwin Stanton was a bit of a difficult person to get along with. In fact, his early impressions of Lincoln were very, very negative, and he made it clear to Lincoln that he didn't think much of him. But Lincoln, being the guy that he was, he hired people based on their commitment to the country and their skill, and he didn't take anything personally. I don't know how he did it, but he hired a lot of people that personally did not give him any respect. And then they learned to respect him. Edwin Stanton was one of these people. But Edwin Stanton couldn't stand Andrew Johnson. The radical Republicans wanted to make sure that their ally in cabinet could not be fired. So they passed this law that says the president cannot fire his cabinet members without permission from Congress. The president decides to challenge the law, and he fires Edwin Stanton. Here's the problem. If the law was legally passed, and it was in Congress, right? And then the president, now I don't think he signed this thing, but he didn't have to, because remember, Congress can just override the veto. And this was early enough in the session that he couldn't just put it in his pocket and wait for Congress to expire, which is what happens nowadays when a president doesn't want to sign a controversial law. If it comes to a controversial bill, if it comes to him late in the congressional session, let's say there's a week left before Christmas holidays, he just doesn't sign it. Then Congress expires, and you have to start all over again from scratch. But this was way too early. He couldn't not sign this thing. So it got passed into law. Johnson fires Edwin Stanton, right? But now the president has formally broken a law. If the president formally breaks a law, you can legally remove him from office, according to our Constitution. And you do it, first, the House of Representatives drafts articles of impeachment. They say, we suspect there has been a clear case of breaking the law, and we will investigate to see if a formal trial must take place, the way a grand jury does, or in most recent history has not done. The House of Representatives very quickly, because the majority Republicans said, yes, it looks like a law was broken here. Articles of impeachment are now issued. So, in the spring of 1868, the Senate begins a formal trial of President Johnson to see if he is going to be legally removed from office. And all you need is 2/3 of the Senate to remove him. 2/3 have to vote positively to remove him from office, to declare him guilty. And as we all know, The Republicans in the Senate had more than they needed, 2/3. Johnson was scared out of his mind, but he managed to escape by the skin of his teeth. Why? Not because there was a vote had and he lost, but because he basically realized that if he wanted to be, he didn't want to be the first president in American history to be formally removed from office. So he backed down. He says, "Just let me finish out my term," and the term is over at the end of 1868. Remember, Lincoln was elected in 1864, so Johnson, who fulfilled Lincoln's term, would be over in 1868 in just a few months, and he did. But it also helped him that, just like Bill Clinton, who was impeached, but then his case went to the court, to the Senate, a lot of people got nervous, and they said, if Congress can this easily remove a sitting president, we are really interfering with checks and balances in this country, and that leads to constitutional confusion. So people were looking for a reason not to get rid of Johnson, and for Clinton, people over time just realized it may not be the best idea to eliminate a president simply because of an extramarital affair. Morally reprehensible, but politically necessary to help the country, many people said not so much. So, in the 1868 presidential election, things got pretty bad now that Johnson is not running for re-election. The Republicans used a method of election which they're still using today. If you want national security, trust the Republican Party. They're good on defense. They will keep a strong military. The Republicans are still using that as a means to beat up the Democratic Party to this day. And they actually had an advantage. Ulysses S. Grant, the commander-in-chief, the general-in-chief of Union forces who won the Civil War, he was running as the Republican candidate for president. The Democrats used a type of electioneering which they have used a lot in the past and continue to use up until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s. The Democratic Party at this time was very comfortable race baiting, saying if you vote for the Republicans, you're voting for complete racial equality. And they used every negative stereotype, every joke, every fear in their arsenal to scare white voters to not vote for the Republicans, excuse me. Now, you might say, I don't understand, isn't the Democratic Party of today really the party that most African Americans vote for? Yes. And that was because of the great political revolution of the 1960s, which, if you're interested in it, I talk about in the spring in my 211 class. Ulysses Grant wins this victory handily. But it wasn't such a resounding victory that the Republicans felt they could sit on their laurels, their victory. They realized there's increasingly less and less support for extreme activities on the part of civil rights and political rights for blacks in the South. So what's left over? We've abolished slavery, check, 13th Amendment. We've guaranteed citizenship regardless of race, check, 14th Amendment. What's left? Voting. All right, fire it up, let's see what we get. The 15th Amendment was next on the list. And it basically says you cannot deny the right to vote to anyone because of race. Gender was left out, which was interesting. The women's rights movement and first the abolitionists, then the black civil rights movement operated hand in hand from the 1830s and 40s onward. But this is where they broke apart, because when it came to the 15th Amendment, votes for blacks, it broke apart the civil rights and women's rights movement, because it became impossible for many people to turn down voting rights for blacks because women were not included. It just broke the alliance in half. And women didn't get the vote until the 1920, excuse me. Not as a consequence of this, but this didn't help. Now, 15th Amendment is an interesting document because, A, it guaranteed the right to vote for all blacks, even in the North, where even though there was not slavery, there was limitations to voting. But what was very quickly discovered is that you can deny someone the right to vote. Excuse me, you cannot deny the right to vote based on race, according to the 15th Amendment. But you can think of other ways to deny the right to vote. A poll tax, you have to pay a certain amount of money to be able to vote. A literacy test, if you can't read, you can't vote. Now you might say, well, doesn't that also disqualify poor, illiterate Southern whites in addition to blacks? Yes, it does. But the point was to disenfranchise as many blacks as possible. And if you got a few whites in there, people didn't care. But this would be something that was realized in a few short years. Now, the other thing I want to talk about, one of the other things I want to talk about is what's known as this great constitutional revolution. This idea of equality regardless of race, like as long as you're born here, you're a citizen, was huge. Because not only did it provide equality, technically, in the face of the law for all blacks, North and South, but America was increasingly becoming a haven for immigrants. Up until this point, all I've talked about is German and Irish immigrants. But by the end of the 19th century, America would be literally flooded with Eastern European Jews, Russians, Poles, Italians by the millions. And in the West, Japanese and Chinese, which eventually led to laws to limit their immigration. All of these folks, once their kids were born, citizenship. This was huge in terms of the future political rights of all peoples. Now, the other big change that I want to bring to your attention that was a result of the Civil War and the Reconstruction amendments is the changing role of the federal government. Let me take you a step back. Do you remember the Bill of Rights? Yes? All right. Does anybody remember what the First Amendment is? The First Amendment?
Freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech. Now, does anybody remember what the wording was of the First Amendment? Like, did it say everybody's allowed to say whatever they want? No. Do you remember what they did say? No?
Is that freedom of speech?
Here's my point. The wording of all the amendments, all of them begin with a preamble that says, Congress shall make no law abridging la 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 la. The Bill of Rights was specifically set up to limit the activities of the national government because of this tremendous fear that Americans have about government authority. Right? And so the Bill of Rights says, this is what the Constitution says, this is what the federal government can do. The Bill of Rights says, this is what the federal government cannot do to take away people's individual rights. Correct? But things change with the Reconstruction amendments. Thank you. Stay awake. Now, things change with the Reconstruction amendments because for the first time, the federal government is not the big bad, national government that cannot be trusted. For the first time, the national government is the protector of civil rights. Before, people felt the states were the more appropriate guarantor of individual liberties because they knew what the people wanted in their states. But here's the thing. A respect for states' rights and a limitation of the federal government had led to the perpetuation of slavery in the South by people saying, it's not our business, the South, that's the part of their culture. It's not my business to get involved. I live in Maine. Why do I have an opinion about slavery in Mississippi? It's not my business. States' rights. I don't want them interfering in my business. I'm not going to interfere in their business. But As Lincoln said in his second inaugural, everybody knew the war was about slavery. And we dealt with it as a country. We abolished it, we fought the war, we reunited the country. And to protect those accomplishments, it has to be the role of the federal government. You just can't trust the states because they're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. So this was a huge deal. It completely changed the idea of the role of the federal government in American history. It was no longer the place to be feared because it had too much power. It was now the place to go to if you weren't getting a fair shake at the local government level and the state government level. Of course, the problem was if the federal government itself was racist, then you're screwed, top to bottom. But I digress. Now, in terms of the boundaries of citizenship, Asian immigrants, right from the very beginning, were denied. Like they couldn't apply to become citizens. Their children could because of the 14th Amendment, but they themselves couldn't apply. Why? In the Northeast, we get comfortable talking about racism as black and white, and that's obviously true. But if you were to live in Texas, Florida, New Mexico, Arizona, racism there would be brown and white. If you lived in California, it would be yellow and white. I'm sorry to be using these silly colored terms, but you know what I'm talking about. In California, on the West Coast, it was not the fear of blacks that led to racial animosity. It was the fear of Japanese and Chinese poor immigrant laborers that led to anti-immigrant legislation. This was a part of that sentiment. And as I mentioned, women were also denied the right to vote with the 15th Amendment. Now, what did radical Reconstruction actually pull off? A lot. Now that you have the military in the South protecting the safety and the activities of Southern blacks, they don't have to be afraid of being lynched on the street by people that don't fear any political repercussions. You have the explosion of Southern black political and social organization. Massive public gatherings to demand anything. Labor strikes. Black workers going on legal strikes for the first time, demanding better pay, better working conditions. Forming groups of the Republican Party in the South, the basis of their voting and political organization. And most importantly, voter registration. Voter registration has always intrigued me. I'm originally from Canada. You know how you're registered to vote in Canada? By being alive. The moment the government has your address, you're registered to vote. That's how Europe does it. You don't have to actually go around saying, would you like to vote? Can I sign you up? I'm not quite sure why it's done that way in this country, but now that it was safe to do so in the South, voter registration went through the roof, as it did after the Civil Rights Acts of the 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 65. Now, the new Southern state governments, now that blacks have the right to organize and increasingly the right to vote, were now overtaken by Republicans. Because Southern blacks were voting Republican. They were not voting for the Democratic Party. Black Republicans dominated their Southern wing of the Republican Party. White Republicans came out of the woodwork, declared their party affiliation, but they were disliked by their white brethren. Either they came from the North, and they were called carpetbaggers, which is still a term used today for someone who goes from one part of the country to another, or scalawags, Southerners who turned their back on their white brethren by joining the Republican Party. Much was done by these new Southern state governments. Finally, some movement was made on public education, civil and political equality, and a fairer system of justice, the ability to sit on juries, the ability to testify against whites. So, but there were some shortcomings which came back to haunt them. These Southern state Reconstruction governments, they're called. Southern state governments that were both voted by and staffed by black Republicans. Now, one of the most important was economic stagnation. There was a continuing cycle of poverty in the South that was not broken. One way to have broken the cycle of poverty was simply to break up the old plantations, give the lands to former slaves, allow them to be independent farmers. But that was taken off the table very early on. The idea was, if we can get Northerners to build their factories in the South, railroads in the South, if we can just bring Northerners to the South to build what they need to build, and they can put Southerners to work, we will have a new modern industrialized South. But the problem was Northerners didn't want to invest in the South. Can you guess why? Or did I write it? Yeah, go ahead. What's that? Not out of spite, because businessmen will go wherever it's most advantageous to do business. Low cost, high profit. If you were a northern wealthy person and you wanted to build a railroad or a factory and you were guaranteed cheap labor in the South, what would be the primary reason for you to not take advantage of that opportunity?
Because like the owner, they only own like a huge farm for themselves, not like the north.
Well, you can get around that. You're building a factory, you're building railroads, but what would be the thing that would scare you away from investing in the South? What's that?
Because they're already in poverty?
Not yet. Well, this is the point to try and help them get out of poverty. Go ahead.
Because you don't know much about the business that they're going to do.
They would learn that. But let me ask you this. As blacks are becoming politically organized, they're voting, socially organized. They're now in Southern governments as congressmen, as senators, as state legislators. How do you think Southern whites responded to this black empowerment?
Well, I thought they probably were going to take over.
Yes, but do you think they kept it to themselves? No. What ended up happening in the South, in the face of this black political empowerment, was an organization on the part of whites into, where are they? This. The KKK.
Oh, that's what it came from.
That's where it came from. A militant, organized, secret organization meant to intimidate blacks and their white allies away from the voting booth, destroying their businesses, setting fire to their homes, intimidating them to keep them off the streets and out of public life. Now, it was secret, obviously, because it was illegal to do these things, and it was done at night to avoid the federal army that was there to protect civil rights. But, go ahead.
Isn't that a movie about that? I think I've seen a movie.
The very first movie made in America was called Birth of a Nation, which embarrassingly details the triumphant birth of the KKK as a defense of white civilization.
I think I've seen that movie.
I suspect many people have seen this movie because it is taught in all film history classes, because it's the first American motion picture. It's just too bad it's such a disreputable topic. So, I'm sure you know the KKK. There's pictures. Men in bed sheets with hoods over their heads, burning crosses, because nothing says, fear like a burning cross. And they are everywhere, all over the South, and increasingly in the North as well. Like, this is a march in Oregon, the Pacific Northwest. This is not Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi.
So they weren't really in secret.
Well, the thing is, the hoods hid their identities. Go ahead, say what you want to say. Sorry?
No, that's basically what hit it. You said it.
Yeah, but also, it's also an open secret. Everybody knew who was in the Klan.
But it wasn't allowed.
Yeah, but as long as, here's the thing. You're allowed to march and express your freedom of speech peacefully like this,
How about?
Well, that,
That's in the nighttime.
That's in it.
This.
That's
But again, this here, if there's no actual activity taking place that infringes on somebody else's civil rights, then this is just a weird custom, right? And for the recording, I'm pointing to the top right-hand photo of the burning crosses. This down here, this is a peaceful march. It's of a disreputable group of people, but it's a peaceful march. You can't deny them the right to march. Where it gets obviously problematic is when they go from this, to, where is it? This, right? But let me ask you this. How confident do you think they felt that they could actually take pictures of what they were doing? Incredibly confident.
Yes.
If you're breaking the law en masse with, this is a lynching, and you're comfortable enough to have people take a photograph of you, now yes, you're all, covered in sheets and everything, but chances are, if you really wanted to, you could figure out who these people were. And in fact, the federal government did. The federal government passed a couple of acts in 1870-71 to empower federal marshals to simply go down there and start arresting people simply on suspicion of being a Klansman, and then say, are you a Klansman, yes or no? And then, get a confession out of them. Then they say, look, well, who else do you know is a member of the Klan? And then you went out and arrested those people. Now, yes, civil rights of these individuals were thrown out the window, but the amount of murders, and I don't mean individuals, I don't mean like a few homes were burnt here and there, I mean entire towns were surrounded and massacred. This was not just some random gang violence. This was an organized army to exterminate blacks, as well as intimidate the ones they didn't exterminate. Now, there was also, like I mentioned, another Civil Rights Act passed in 1875. But like all the other ones up until 1964, it didn't have much enforcement. Now, as effective as these enforcement acts were, the North, after 1870, 71, after the 15th Amendment, after the enforcement acts, they were tired. They were tired of what seemed, they believed, the continuation of the Civil War. We already won the war. Why do we still have troops in the South? Why do we still have to talk about race? Why do we still have to talk about civil rights and la 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 la? I'm tired. I'm tired of spending all this money. I'm tired of all this division between North and South. This is how people were starting to talk by the early 1870s. Essentially, those enforcement acts in the 15th Amendment was the peak of Northern interest in reconstructing the South with racial equality, legal and political racial equality. After that, they just got tired. And there's a lot of reasons for this. First, a lot of these older radical Republicans, the guys that were just fighting for abolition in the 1850s and during the Civil War, they started dying off. And they weren't replaced by other people as committed to racial equality. Second, many liberal Republicans that could have been counted on to support the enforcement acts and so on and so forth, they ran into a number of political corruption scandals, so even their voices were now tarnished in the public eye. As I mentioned on a number of occasions, the North was not less racist than the South. The only reason they got comfortable with the Emancipation Proclamation and putting blacks in the blue suit of the Union Army and then passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, the first part was to win the war. The second part was a continuing momentum. And to be honest, I think there was this belief that if you actually pass a constitutional amendment, you abolish slavery, you guarantee citizenship, and you guarantee voting, then that's it. We can stop talking about race. We can pull the troops out of the South and everyone's happy. That was obviously naive. In 1873, America began a great recession, depression. It began and stopped frequently, but realistically, between 1873 and 1896, the American economy went into the toilet, which means people became very conscious about spending money, like the millions of dollars spent on the Northern Army occupying the southern states. People were less and less interested in paying taxes for that. And what really sucked, the Supreme Court came back and said these enforcement acts are simply unconstitutional. You can't simply arrest people not in a time of war because you feel like it. You have to have cause, real probable cause to arrest someone. You can't arrest someone, force a confession out of them, and then arrest other people. It's simply unconstitutional. So many of the Klansmen that were arrested, and the Klan was broken in the early 70s, they were freed, they went home, they started doing what they were doing in the past. In 1874, you really get a sense that the South, the white supremacist South, is starting to take power back. They call themselves redeemers. They accuse the black Republicans who had taken over the southern state governments of corruption, inefficiency, and ruining the South. They were going to redeem the South. These were all white Democrats. And little by little, they started taking over southern state governments one by one through voting, but also political intimidation, because as I just mentioned, many of the Klansmen that were arrested under the Enforcement Acts were now freed. And there was less and less interest in policing their activities. In 1874, the Democrats take over the House of Representatives, which is huge. Because remember, the Democratic Party had a northern wing and a southern wing. And once the southern states accepted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, they were allowed to send congressmen and senators to D.C. But the ones they sent were all going to be Southerners and white, especially once you stopped allowing blacks to vote. And how did they do that? Election fraud, massive violence at the voting booth, massive violence, especially in areas with a high concentration of black voters. Unpunished violence. Within 2 years, the entire South was taken over by white Democrats. All that political organization on the part of blacks between 1867 and 1876 was wiped out. And part of the reason for this is Northerners stopped enforcing civil rights and political rights in the South. The end of Reconstruction, and really the end of this class, is the presidential election of 1876. In the presidential election of 1876, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, it was assumed he would likely be a shoo-in and win the presidency. But many of the Electoral College votes in the South were disputed, partly because of all the voter intimidation and voter fraud. And so at the end of the day, it was a razor-thin election. And so it went into the House of Representatives. The Constitution says if it's a close election, the House of Representatives chooses a committee to decide who the next president is. In the House of Representatives, I just mentioned the Democrats have the majority. So Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican candidate for president, made a deal with the Democrats in the House of Representatives and said, if you vote for me and not for your fellow Democrat, I promise you I will pull the army out of the South. I will take them out of all policing duties, and all I ask from you in return is a promise that you will respect Southern black civil and political rights. The Democrats said, of course we will. Rutherford B. Hayes was made the President of the United States by the grand bargain of 1877. And he did what he said he would do. He pulled the army back. He sent them into their barracks. They were no longer on the streets. They were no longer doing what minimal policing they were doing. And thereafter, the southern state governments, one by one, passed a whole series of Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws, state laws that legally segregated and disenfranchised Southern blacks. This was the era where the law said there would be white schools, there would be black schools. There would be white-only churches, black-only churches. All public accommodations would be divided black and white, legally. And the vote would be taken away from blacks by poll taxes, by literacy tests, and by something called the grandfather clause. If your grandfather was a slave, then you couldn't vote. These were all ridiculous laws. They were all unconstitutional at the national level, but no one challenged them. And when they did, and this is for History 211, even the Supreme Court upheld this segregation, And they did so by saying, you can segregate the races in America as long as it's separate but equal. So that's Jim Crow. And that's why we needed a civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s to overturn these state laws, which segregated blacks from whites and took away their voting rights. And in spite of this case, Plessy v. Ferguson of, I think, 1896, that said you can have separate as long as it's equal, the reality was when you separated blacks away from whites in schools, public accommodations, whatever, they were always, always, always given less public funding. And so it was never equal. And that's why we needed the Civil Rights Act. This is a painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that gives you an idea of the progress of blacks in American history. Slave, a freed Union soldier, and after the war, wounded, missing a leg, unemployed, the uniform now becomes the only clothing he's got. No skills, no land, just the legacy of service in the Union, abandoned by the North. And that's it. I'm done. Do you have any